So hello everyone and welcome to the 8th session in the Space 101 series. I'm Jamil Castillo with the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration, an advocacy group based in Washington, D.C., representing over 50 companies from around the nation focused on space exploration. The Coalition is also the organization that hosts the Space 101 series. Today's webinar is going to go over launch windows for the Artemis lunar missions. And for that, we have three experts here with us whose conversation today is going to be moderated by Janet Carica. And just a little bit about Janet. Janet Carica is a recognized subject matter expert on space policy, space transportation, and non-proliferation. She is currently serving as NASA's principal advisor for space transportation, responsible for resolving cross-agency challenges and issues, and advises NASA's space transportation programs. She also works with other government space transportation stakeholders, including the National Space Council, the Federal Aviation Administration, the Air Force Space Command, and the Space Force. Previously, Janet served as NASA's Chief of Staff. Prior to NASA, she served as the Executive Advisor to the Air Force for Space Acquisition Programs and as the Assistant for Launch Systems for the Office of the Secretary of Defense. During her military career, she was a Director for Launch Programs at the Air Force Program Executive Office for Space, where she oversaw the transition from heritage launch programs to the Evolved Expandable Launch Vehicle programs Atlas V and Delta IV. Janet holds bachelor and master's degrees in mechanical engineering. And now over to you, Janet, to have a wonderful conversation with our three experts today.
Thank you so much, Jamil, and welcome everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us. This is the last Space 101 that the Coalition is doing before launch, and we are very excited to have the three experts that have agreed to do this. We are getting ready to go, and I'm just so grateful that everybody took the time to be here for us. The way we're going to work this is I'll give brief intros of who everyone is, and then we'll have each one of them speak for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to do Q&A. Please just send your questions in the chat, and I'll moderate the chat, and then Jamil will wrap it up. So first of all, we have Mike Sarafin. So the way these are chunked up, we're going to talk about the mission and launch windows with our mission management team lead. Then we'll talk about Orion, which is the show, and how Orion influences what we do with our launch windows. And then finally, we have our representative who runs the range, who's going to talk to us about the difficulty in scheduling windows and the puts and takes and all the different equities involved in doing that. So without further ado, I will introduce Mike Sarafin, who, bless him, is at the airport, ready to come here to Florida to start the final days of our launch campaign. So we're very grateful that he's agreed to do this. Mike Sarafin is, as I said, the mission manager for our Artemis mission to return to the moon. It's, as you know, our maiden flight, and it is an uncrewed Orion spacecraft flying into proving grounds around the moon. He is the launch decision authority, giving the final go to proceed with launch. He provides risk acceptance at the agency level and oversight of mission operations across all flight phases. He even has requirements change authority. And he also was flight director. He represents the government in all these missions. Prior to this, he has 87, he has served as one of 87 individuals who led human space flight operations as a NASA flight director. He's done 64 human spaceflight missions, shuttle, station, everything, international missions, all of it. So he's a tremendous expert, and we're very glad to have him. And if we can advance one chart over to you, Mike.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Janet, and welcome to everyone to this launch window discussion. We are going to put what we are about to talk to you about to use here, hopefully in a couple of weeks when we launch Artemis 1, and it feels at this point like we're on the right trajectory to be ready to fly as early as August the 29th. So with that, if you look at the mission availability chart, what's baked into that are a whole host of considerations. Most of them are driven by physics, and really one of the foundations of a launch window is what is the performance that you have versus the performance that you need to accomplish your mission. And the performance that you have comes in the form of the rocket. In our case, for the Space Launch System, it's the core stage with the four RS-25 engines, the boosters with the two 5-segment solid rocket boosters, and then the upper stage with the single RL-10 engine. But it also comes in the form of the spacecraft, the Orion spacecraft, which has a service module that allows us to propel the vehicle out and back as we head out to the moon. Most missions most commercial missions and other missions that launch science missions, they are one way. They head outbound, but they don't ever come back to Earth. But the Artemis program is unique in that we're developing a transportation system in the form of the Space Launch System rocket and the Orion spacecraft that provides transportation out to the lunar destinations, the cislunar vicinity, and then allows us to get back safely. We can't run out of gas. There are no space stations about the moon, at least not yet. And those are key facets of what we look at when we determine a launch window, is we have to have enough performance to get us safely to the orbit that we're targeting and then back. So on Artemis 1, we're targeting what's called a distant retrograde orbit. And it's retrograde because it is in the Earth-Moon plane, and the orbit is opposite the direction that the moon orbits the Earth. So we're in a retrograde orbit, and it's distant because at its farthest point, we're some 38,000 miles from the surface of the moon. So our target orbit, again, on Artemis 1 is the distant retrograde orbit. And when we fly to the moon, unlike when we fly to low Earth orbit, we have a three-body problem. We've got the Earth, we've got the moon, and then the spacecraft that needs to head outbound to the moon and back. And it's pretty tricky when you think about it. We've got the Earth rotating on its axis. It completes a full rotation every 24 hours. We've got the moon orbiting about the Earth. It completes one full orbit every lunar cycle, or every 29 days. And then we need to go outbound from the launch site out to the moon and then back to our targeted splashdown location. So when we look at our mission availability, there are several key constraints baked into it. The performance of the integrated system, that's the rocket and the spacecraft, to get to our targeted orbit. There is our targeted splashdown location, which in our case is in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of California. There is the capability of the spacecraft as it comes back to Earth and re-enters the Earth's atmosphere, and we have a certain range that we can bleed off all of that entry as part of a direct re-entry. So that is what we call our range from entry interface to splashdown constraint. And then we have a lighting constraint, at least for this mission, to aid recovery operations at the landing site. So we're trying to hit a daylight landing in the Pacific Ocean. And then our final constraint is any additional constraints that we have on the spacecraft. And in our case, it is the ability of the spacecraft to produce power along the trajectory. And if we have an eclipse of the solar rays, so the solar rays are blocked from producing power because the Earth sits between it and the sun, we call that an eclipse constraint. And if that eclipse constraint is greater than 90 minutes, we screen out those days. So what you see here on this page kind of maps all those constraints out, maps all those ground rules out against our mission profile that we're intending to fly. And we have gray days, which we do not have enough performance to achieve our targeted orbit with our rocket. That is unique to this Block 1 vehicle with the interim cryo propulsion stage. When we upgrade to the enhanced upper stage or the exploration upper stage, we should be able to launch from a performance standpoint pretty much every day. So when we get to Artemis 4 and later missions, we will have performance that's daily, but when we have the Block 1 version of the rocket with the interim cryo propulsion stage, we're only able to launch for the green days that you see. We have light green days that are what we call short class missions, and we have dark green days, which are what are called long class missions. And we vary the mission duration based on the day that we fly. When we initially looked at mission availability for Artemis 1, it wasn't as good as we would like. We could only launch approximately 1 week per month. And that was for what's roughly a 26-day or a short class mission. And that assumed that we went out to the moon and we spent half a lap in that distant retrograde orbit. When we challenged the team to come up with a method of improving our launch probability, they came up with what's called a long class mission, where we spend 1.5 laps in that distant retrograde orbit, which are the dark green days, and that is somewhere between a 38 and a 42-day mission. So when we added the long class missions, we essentially doubled our mission availability, and for Artemis 1, we're able to launch roughly half of the month. The red days are days where we have additional spacecraft constraints come into play. That could be an eclipse constraint or a range to entry interface constraint or some other constraint where the rocket is able to do its job, but the spacecraft does not meet one of its capabilities. So those are some of the fundamentals of the Artemis 1 mission, this unique vehicle configuration, the Block 1 version of the Space Launch System, as well as the unique aspects of this distant retrograde orbit. So those are some of the basics, and with that, Janet, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a great summary of how all this works. Now we're going to turn it over to Andy Scott. Andy Scott is the manager for Lockheed Martin's Orion Mission Analysis and Performance Team within the Mission Architecture and Integration Organization. One of the things that his team is responsible for is understanding the launch opportunity variability in NASA's mission plans to ensure that the Orion team can validate the spacecraft's capable of performing within the range of those plans. He helps define constraints to assure that Orion's capable of performing the mission. He's worked for Lockheed for 20 years, and he's worked on next generation human spacecraft during that entire time. We're very lucky to have him talk about Orion, which is the whole reason we're doing this. It is the show, it is the mission, and we're just very happy that you could take the time. So over to you, Andy.
Yes, thank you, Janet. Yeah, so I'm going to be going a little bit more detail on the Orion constraints that drive our launch availability. Mike already touched on several of them, but I will kind of break it down that there's essentially 5 major areas that kind of constrain the launch availability. The first is the basic propulsive capability of Orion and SLS, which I think Mike gave a great summary of some of the challenges with the orbital mechanics that drive that problem, that basically set the base of all of our non-gray dates that you sort of see here on this chart. The second one is our daytime landing constraint. In order to assure that we have a very safe and successful recovery of the Orion spacecraft, a constraint that we're imposing for this first mission is that we do want to land during daytime landing conditions so that we can have a safe and successful recovery of the spacecraft. And that constraint is one of those that does drive what time of the month you can come back from the moon. And that is one of the constraints that drove the team to come up with the long and short class mission options that Mike had given a good summary of. And the idea there is that on any one day, one of those mission classes are going to have a return opportunity that lands during daylight landing conditions. And so that is kind of how that particular constraint has driven our launch availability and the desire to have these 2 classes of mission. So that is our landing conditions. The third criteria is our downrange. That we are going to be flying during the entry portion of flight on the way back. Downrange is just the distance that we measure from where we appreciably enter the atmosphere from where we splash down near San Diego. And one of the key flight test objectives of our Artemis 1 mission is to test out our heat shield and thermal protection system. And to accomplish that, we have set constraints on how far of a downrange might be too far and what minimum downrange we'd like to have in order to learn what we'd like to and achieve our flight test objectives. And so the minimum distance that we're trying to achieve is at least 2,500 nautical miles. And at times we can, for Artemis 1, fly up to 4,000. That is something that in future missions we hope to extend. But using this mission to learn what we can is how we intend to do so. That's our downrange constraint. The fourth one, which Mike also mentioned, is our eclipse constraint. And eclipse is just what we refer to is it's really an eclipse with respect to Orion's perspective. It's basically what you see when we fly through the shadow of the Earth or the Moon. We are a solar-powered vehicle, and so it is very important that we get sun on those solar arrays to charge up our batteries so that we can get through challenging and dynamic times when we cannot be in favorable positions for power generation. And one of the constraints on the mission that we have established is a maximum length on how long those eclipses can be. And the primary reason for that constraint, as it started, is primarily thermal reasons. Originally, we had constraints that the tips of the solar rays would just get a little too cold if we stayed in a 90-minute eclipse. Understand since that has been improved, we might be able to tolerate longer eclipses for future missions. But for Artemis 1, we have stuck with that 90-minute constraint to keep ourselves thermally stable. Eclipses also drive our power analysis, and that is the fifth category that does constrain our mission opportunities. We do want to make sure that we maintain our batteries and power capacity above a minimum threshold in order to accomplish the mission while also preserving margin for contingencies that we might see. And it is a little more complicated to determine which days are good or not for our power perspective, because it's a combination of several complicated factors. The eclipses are a major one, but our attitude, timelines, what we are doing from a concept of operations at the time also plays into it heavily. So it is not just important to keep the eclipses short, but when they happen, it is best that they happen away from other dynamic events. Generally bad to deploy our solar arrays and then happen to be coming into an eclipse right after that. And so we have developed some tools to screen through all of the mission opportunities that are being considered in a rapid fashion to identify these pinch points during the mission where you might have an eclipse too close to a dynamic event that reduces our power margins below thresholds we don't feel comfortable with. And that's the fifth category. And ultimately, it's those Orion constraints like the power and the eclipses that drive the red boxes that you see on this chart. Those are the Orion-driven opportunities that we are not able to do for our reasons. So that's kind of the high-level overview of kind of the 5 major things that drive our launch vehicle selections. So with that, I will hand it back to Janet.
Thank you so much, Andy. And last but absolutely not least, because we could not do this mission without the range, we have Lieutenant Colonel Colin Mims. He is the commander for the First Range Operations Squadron at Cape Canaveral. He leads the world-class team that is providing real-time command and control at the Eastern Range for our launch. He has purview over more than 50 launch events each year. He did time at Vandenberg and the Cape, so he understands both worlds. And we are very, very happy to have him in his 18 years of active duty service. He's done all of it, director of operations, director of operations, division chief. He's been at many stateside assignments and also deployed in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. So we're very honored to have him, and I turn it over to you, Lieutenant Colonel Mims.
Okay, thank you so much, Janet, for that introduction. First off, I'd really like to talk to you about the public safety mission that we perform. When we have operations involving a launch vehicle that are ongoing, safety is always a concern, whether it's personnel working on the vehicle, base personnel, or public during launch and flight. We want to make sure that it's safe. To do this, we have to understand all the operations that are happening on base to ensure that we're not putting personnel in jeopardy. We do this through setting up roadblocks and accounting for personnel in flight areas when there's an ongoing mission. With a new mission like Artemis, during launch and rehearsals, the safety area is very conservative and large. We close more area around the operation and until the vehicle has proven itself. As the program matures, though, we'll decrease the amount of area needed, that space needed, and allow people and vehicles to move a little closer in and around that area. Historically, we wouldn't allow neighboring operations, and again, as I said earlier, we block off more area than needed. Now we use better risk management techniques and attempt to right-size what we call the blast damage area in the flight caution area. you know, and as you alluded to, you know, we're having as many launches, over 50 launches. We're extremely busy. In the next 12 months, we have 75 launches scheduled, and we have to deconflict and share the range with 5 other customers. The rockets, they just don't show up and launch. This always creates challenges for new programs since they don't fully understand the range and the amount of resources required to support testing and those pre-launch milestones to get them to that launch. Additionally, new launch providers have to learn all of our documentation, how to fill out our scheduling forms. And then, you know, looking at the SLS Artemis campaign, it will require over 80 operations to be scheduled to get that rocket off the ground. But as this program matures, we expect that number to decrease. So when we compare it to an extremely mature program, we might average about, you know, 40 operations to get that vehicle off the ground. The SLS launch campaign required multiple wet dress rehearsals and multiple countdown tests that lasted between about 11 and 16 hours each. And during these tests, we're using a significant amount of range assets and supporting personnel. Also, the SLS being one of the largest rockets ever constructed, we have to ensure that the commodities and consumables like liquid oxygen and the like are available. We must deconflict our schedule to ensure that the SLS has what it needs and move other users around as needed. The entirety of scheduling is like a well-choreographed play. There are more people all around the base performing separate duties that are supporting all stages of launches. And then really, you know, to keep up with, you know, this busy range that we have, we've really had to innovate. You know, if we look at last week or 2 weeks ago, you know, we had 2 launches in 24 hours, which hasn't been done in over 55 years. We work extremely hard to coordinate and deconflict numerous activities to get to yes. We've changed the way that we support commercial launches like SpaceX through the use of online communication platforms and the numbers of personnel that we have on console for a day of launch, which has saved hundreds, if not thousands, of man hours and really allows us to get to that multiple launches in a day. Additionally, SLD 45 was granted a waiver from the FAA that allows safety personnel to assess naval aircraft participating in naval operations to be calculated at a probability of impact in 1 in 100,000 instead of 1 in a million for all SpaceX launches. And while that sounds insignificant, it reduces the amount of time to secure the airspace because, again, we have to share the airspace with rockets, and we have to share, you know, the ocean with the cruise ships that are going around us. So removing some of that overlap has saved us over 1,100 hours in deconfliction and allows the Navy to operate more freely as well. Additional improvements that we've made is in our scheduling process. Used to the scheduling process to get a rocket for an approved launch date went all the way up to the base commander or a 1-star general. Now that's been delegated down to me. Additionally, that took a lot of time to get there. It would take 7 to 10 days for full coordination of all the tests and test agencies before we could approve that launch date. And you know, as I've kind of talked about, securing an approved launch date, a launch opportunity is an intricate, time-intensive process that requires the resolution of multiple moving parts with external agencies. Our new launch process outlined we use caveats, and so it allows our customers continue planning while other things are being conflicted around them. And so we can really shorten that 7 to 10 day time frame to, you know, just a few days. And, you know, as kind of stated earlier, as Artemis and SLS matures, the mission support is going to be a great deal easier. We're already finding scheduling and process efficiencies through the lessons learned and how they've begun to schedule. So again, thank you very much for the time, Janet, for talking, and that's all I have.
You bet. That was great. And, you know, having worked this stuff over 40 years, I got to say, it was so exciting to see you guys launch 2 rockets 13 hours apart. It was just amazing, you know, between ULA and SpaceX, and the range has so modernized. General Purdy, as you said, has pushed a lot of responsibility down, which is amazing. And it's helped the range be so responsive. And we can't thank you guys enough for how flexible and just great you've been through this whole thing. You know, when you and I talked, you talked about us being the customer, and while we're, you know, and I mean, I just think that's amazing attitude, and we just can't thank you guys enough. So I have a moderator's privilege to ask a couple questions, but I think since Alex has already asked one, I'm going to go straight into his question because it relates to Mike Sarafin. If Mike has to drop to catch the plane, I want to make sure we get it in. So Mike, Alex asked, he had downloaded an earlier version of this chart, and so he wanted to make sure that Monday, September 19th is now a light green day, right? So it's a short duration mission. His older chart, it was gray. So over to you, Mike, if you'd like to explain how we update this for as we get closer to launch.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Alex. It is a great question. When we look at mission availability, we look about 2 months out in terms of what we call our final mission analysis. And that is the, no kidding, final run of all the constraints that we talk through using the latest trajectory data, the latest performance data that we have. And we consider that the no kidding availability. But when we project things further out than 2 months, we consider that preliminary data that's subject to change based on additional refinement in our final analysis cycle. So in all likelihood, what you have is a version of the mission availability that was more than 2 months old, and since then we've refined it. We do post this publicly, the version that you're seeing publicly, to the NASA website, just for public awareness and public insight. And we do update it when we get our final mission analysis in. In fact, we just posted an update earlier this week, so the very latest is out there that we have. And if we don't make the August or September launch periods for some reason, we're doing what we call a rolling analysis cycle, and we'll catch further months out. It doesn't mean we intend to launch that late. It just means that we've got a analysis process that we are turning the crank on, and we're going to be ready to go from an analysis and launch availability calculation standpoint when the hardware's ready. We have every intent to get the rocket off and the hardware off as soon as we can. So that's just something that you need to keep in mind, and again, is one of the key caveats that we post at the NASA portal.
Thank you so much, Mike. And we have a kind of a eye test version, but just kind of gives you a sense of the next few months ahead and where our gray areas are, dark green and light green and red eclipse areas. So you guys can kind of get a sense of it. That was a great question, Alex. And as usual, we also have an outstanding question from Bill Harwood. Mike, this is over to you again, or anyone else. This one's a little technical, which is expected from Bill, but I want to read this to you, Mike. He said, can you help us visualize the moving targets that help define a launch time? He's trying to visualize how the TLI point is moving with respect to the launch site, the post-perigee raise maneuver orbit, where the burn takes place in that orbit. He wants to know, does TLI basically raise the apogee of the post-perigee raise maneuver orbit to the vicinity of the moon? How does that all change from day to day? And I'll let you give that a shot, Mike. I know you can't read it, but I hope I read it slow enough for you.
Yeah, I'll take a crack at it. And Bill, again, a very, very good question, a thoughtful question. When we look at targeting the moon from a Earth orbit and having what we call a translunar injection maneuver, the timing of that is what they call the antipode, or the point opposite the moon. And depending on when you go within a launch window, and our launch window can vary as much as 2 hours, and depending on the relative position of the moon in that launch window, because the moon's position is changing, but also the moon is slightly inclined relative to the Earth's equator. I believe it's 10.5 degrees. You need to take into account that slight inclination as well as the relative position of the moon, and then perform the translunar injection maneuver at that point opposite, or the antipode. and that puts you on an intercept trajectory for the moon. The way that we account for that is by flying what we call a variable azimuth. So as we head east in an easterly direction off the Cape at Cape Canaveral, downrange, we at window open fly a more northerly azimuth, and in the middle of the window we have our optimal performance, which is essentially a due east trajectory, and then at the close of the window we fly a more southerly azimuth. And that basically biases the ascent trajectory to have that point opposite to account for the launch window variation of the point opposite of the moon. In terms of the apogee and perigee change, when we climb uphill, at least on Artemis 1, we're going to climb into a 975 by 16 nautical mile insertion altitude. We'll perform a follow-on perigee raise maneuver that will put us in the 975 by 100 nautical mile orbit, so an elliptical Earth orbit. And then the point of translunar injection, yes, that's essentially raising your apogee all the way to a point where you will get, you'll have the sphere of influence of the gravity of the moon overtake the sphere of influence of the gravity of the Earth, and then you can set up your lunar trajectory from there. So it's a complicated physics problem. I know a fair amount about trajectory and flight dynamics, but I'm sure people that are far smarter than I am within the agency that do our flight design and our mission analysis. And I guess I'll kick it over to Andy and see if you have anything to add, Andy, on that.
Yeah, no, I think that was a pretty good summary. I think the one part that I would add is the desire, or well, essentially the physics kind of requirement to conduct the TLI burn at that antipode, basically the point equal and opposite from the moon, is one of those constraints that, coupled with our Block 1 configuration in the ICPS, that does limit our general launch availability to sort of a window around each month. And that's driven by the fact that we are going into an elliptical park orbit to begin with. And that constrains our perigee to be in a certain region in the southern hemisphere, which means that we're generally targeting the moon when it is more in the northern hemisphere. And that is one of the major constraints that prevents us from getting that broad launch availability that we're trying to get to with Artemis 4 and the Block 1B and EUS. Once we get to that point, that's when our upper stage will have enough thrust to weight to efficiently put us into a circular orbit, so that that TLI burn can be at basically any latitude and we can keep up with where the moon is. At the moment, that elliptical orbit part constrains where the TLI is a little bit, and then that in turn is a pretty significant restriction on the launch opportunities we have for these early missions. But again, one of those that as we work towards our fully capable Block 1B configuration, that will be a constraint that goes away.
Yeah, Andy, that's a great point. That's a great point. As we use the interim crowd propulsion stage, we have to loft into an elliptical orbit. When we get to the enhanced upper stage or the exploration upper stage, we do not have to do that. We can just go into a circular low Earth orbit, and we don't have to deal with those performance penalties as you described. So yeah, it's a great point.
Well, kudos to you both. That was an excellent answer, particularly Mike, doing it in the chaos of an airport. Your powers of concentration are amazing. Wow, we have such great questions. I can't thank you guys enough for these. These are wonderful. So I'm very happy to ask this question, and I know the answer already, but I will let you guys answer it. This is from Stephen Clark. Also, no surprise, great question. He asks Lieutenant Colonel Mims and Mike, but Lieutenant Colonel Mims, can you provide an update on the status of the flight termination system testing in the VAB? Has NASA and the range come to an agreement to extend the 20-day limit? Lieutenant Colonel Mims, I will turn that over to you to let us unless you need us to give you a quick status, but it's very happy news. And then Mike, you can add a little bit. What Stephen Clark asks is, does this allow for a September 5th launch opportunity with this extension? So over to you, Colin.
Yes, ma'am. So thanks for the question. Yeah, according to safety, yes, we have come to an agreement on that, and we are good till September 5th. But our first launch opportunity is the 29th. And then I'll turn it over to Mike if he has anything else that he wants to add.
Yeah, Stephen, great question. Short answers are yes and yes. Yes, the extension is in work, and yes, that would allow for a September 5th attempt. Last I had heard, the final signature hadn't been achieved yet, but we had agreement to do it, so we're essentially working the paper right now. In terms of the where we are in the systems checkout, yes, we are on the clock right now in terms of the flight termination system, and the checkout is in work right now, and the team is actively working through it.
Yeah, all great news. And thank you for that question. I'm going to go now to Nadia Drake, who asked another great one. She says she might have missed it, but what are the blast damage and flight caution measurements for the Artemis 1 launch? But and in particular, she asks how much for Lieutenant Colonel Mims, do you expect those measurements to change with a flight proven vehicle? So in other words, as we fly this vehicle more and more, how do you expect things like the risk to the public and the blast area and that sort of thing change? Over to you.
So yeah, that's another great question, and that falls in the realm of safety. Unfortunately, I can't really answer that, Ms. Drake. I can get you that real info. I can contact the safety rep and follow up with you. But what I can tell you, historically, the blast areas start out really rather large, and then over time, it's not a huge decrease or exponential decrease, but we slowly, as the vehicle flies over and over again, we slowly reduce that area when we have better measurements around the base and understand the characteristics of the vehicle.
Great answer. Thank you so much. And Bill Harwood asks a question that I think a lot of people find fascinating, and this will be probably to you, Andy. Does Orion die if the batteries are exhausted? He's wondering why the spacecraft couldn't go into what amounts to a safe mode to endure longer eclipses.
Yes, great question. Yes, we do indeed have a safe mode built into our vehicle, as well as multiple redundancies and measures that help us get through challenging situations like potentially longer eclipses. However, for safety reasons, we do not want to rely on those measures for the nominal mission. So it has been ground ruled that we do not want to launch into a mission that nominally would put us into safe mode. We're reserving that capability for extreme contingencies where if we had lost a battery or lost a solar array, or had a extreme contingency where we had to come back in a manner we didn't expect, and maybe that does have a longer eclipse, relying on safe mode, as well as our ability to turn off and power down operations or components that are not critical, are all measures we have to help us get through tough pinch points. But as I mentioned to start, from the nominal mission perspective, those are things we do not want to rely on. We're reserving those capabilities to get us through contingency and faulted scenarios.
Yeah, and Andy, this is Mike. I'll tag on to the back of that one. Bill, similar to what we did with the space shuttle, we've got what we call group A, B, and C power downs. Those are what we call standard power downs that we can manage the vehicle's power levels via just to manage battery discharge, but also when we're in kind of a non-optimal power production mode, we're in an off-pointing angle relative to the sun, and those power downs, are typically powering off non-critical equipment things like cameras and some of our flight instrumentation that is not a flight critical system, like our command and data handling system or the guidance and navigation system. As you get further into the power downs, you start looking at things like payloads and redundant systems, and then as part of that tiered approach, then you eventually get into the safe mode, as Andy described. So there are kind of standardized power downs that allow the team to manage those throughout flight, and those will be implemented from time to time on Artemis 1 just to maintain appropriate charge and discharge levels on the vehicle systems.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm looking through this to make sure we maximize our questions here. I was wondering if, so Bill asks again, if the launch slips into a given window, say by 30 minutes or an hour, does the timing of the subsequent burns change dramatically? Or is it more like just a few minutes here or there? Like if they're still going to guesstimate the timing of events? And this reminds me, Bill, to let you all know, on the NASA website, we have a press kit, a press site. We've worked very, very hard to do the launch timelines and the countdowns and the durations. That should be published soon, an update that we're doing right now. And I really refer you guys, we've worked so hard to make sure that the press site and all the information we have in that press kit could answer a lot of questions, but this is an excellent one. So if we do slip into a given window, Mike, how does the timing of, the launch countdown stuff change? And can you still sort of track the sequence of events based on that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Bill. At least the initial ascent through translunar injection, it'll be very close relative to from kind of the liftoff time through those events, just in terms of, time plus or T plus on the clock. Obviously, relative to the day that we go, the launch windows shift, and the time of day, depending on which time zone you're in, is going to vary. The biggest changes will occur when we're on the return leg and we swap from a short to a long class or a long class to a short class mission. You will see a significant shift in the relative timing. So the answer kind of depends on whether you're talking time relative to liftoff or time relative to the time zone that you're in.
And Mike, I was wondering if maybe you could also address, some of the events when we get to splashdown. So many of my colleagues I've talked to haven't realized that, we're talking October for this mission. And, but reentry and all of this is going to be quite eventful. And I was wondering, Mike, if you could talk to that briefly. And maybe Andy, if you want to join in.
Yeah, so this is Mike again. Yeah, Janet. So that's an excellent point as well. So if you're a recovery operations person, you're looking at recovery minus time. So from the time of splashdown, you got to back up to, all right, when do we need to be on station at the landing zone? If you back up from there, it's the time to sail from port. If you back up from there, it's the time to load the ship. So recovery personnel tend to think in terms of recovery minus. Launch personnel tend to think of in terms of launch minus, and flight personnel tend to think of in terms of launch plus. So depending on which team, depending on which operation you're a part of, we do have variations in timelines and the relative benchmark that they measure against. And I hope that answers your question, Janet. I guess I'll hand it over to Andy and see if he has anything to add.
Yeah, one quick thing that I always thought was interesting was, just an estimate of how long those ships are underway. When they finally leave port and they're underway to do our recovery for our capsule, it's actually much longer than you might think, depending on where the splashdown is.
Yeah, that's correct. I don't quote me on this, but I want to say like the maximum speed of the well deck ship is somewhere around 20 knots, and you've got to set up a meet me date in the ocean where the spacecraft is going to meet based on a reentry guidance and splashdown target, the recovery ship. So if we wanted to land a little farther offshore because the weather close to shore was not favorable, we could go up to 1,200 nautical miles offshore as part of our weather alternate risk management scheme. We could go quite a ways offshore, so you got to account for that and the time that the ship needs to sail out there, and then back that up, you know, in terms of when you need to leave port, the time to get on station, and then that is also accounted for in our entry guidance targets. So there's quite a bit to account for. We'll make those decisions when we're coming back from the distant retrograde orbit. When we do our return powered flyby, that's essentially our deorbit burn from 250,000 miles away, and we've got the better part of a week as we coast back. But that's that all takes into account the timelines and the time effects. Prior to leaving port for the actual recovery operation, the U.S. Navy and NASA conduct what is called just-in-time training. Because the Navy rotates people out fairly frequently, these are enlisted as well as officer personnel. We need to ensure that the people on the ship are trained in the operation, and we do that fairly close to the actual splashdown. So they conduct just-in-time training out in the ocean. They come back to port, do some final preps, and then sail out to the splashdown zone. So it's a week or more to conduct all those activities. And our recovery operations leader and NASA recovery director Melissa Jones has a lot more detail on that than I do. So I guess I'll turn it back to you, Janet or Andy, and see if you have anything to add to that.
Andy, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
I think on the recovery part, that was a great summary that Mike had given. The only thing I would add is maybe to circle back to the original question on how the timing of the mission kind of varies with the time of launch within the window. That could be a 2-hour variation. That does result in, yes, the timing of PRM and TLI also shifting about 2 hours depending on when we launch. But the way we design the mission is that regardless what time it is within that window, they are all aiming for the same insertion point within the distant retrograde orbit. And I mean point and time. So while there may be mission variation in the timeline around 2 hours as you get out to the distant retrograde orbit, once we get there, the mission timeline should nominally be the same regardless of when you launched in the 2-hour window. So that's all I just wanted to add on that one.
Thank you. I was wondering, Colin, if I could ask you real quick, just in general, as you coordinate these range dates and all these different players more and more now, I think you had given me some amazing statistics on all the different launches you're looking at this year and how many different companies you're dealing with. If you could share those, but also do you coordinate missions differently, whether they're government led or commercial? And how do planetary missions and human spaceflight missions, since they take blocks of time, is that different for you than some of the other spacecraft or commercial missions?
So yeah, as I said earlier, we have about 75 other launches in the next 12 months. When it comes to talking to our customers about deconfliction of dates, we really treat government and commercial providers the same. They look for a date, they compete for a date, and really it's the first person that asks for the date, and as long as commodities are available, they get it. Now, if another customer asks for that same date, we'll go and we'll look and make sure, we'll see if commodities are available, we'll see if safety is available, we'll see if KSC can support. So really it's making sure that the range can support all the customers at once. And, that's, as I talked about earlier, that's where we have to get to those innovation ideas. 55 years or 10 years ago, if you said that we were going to have 2 launches in one day, number one, we didn't have the business for it. And number two, that would have been unsupportable. And then, and I think what you're getting, and, when we're talking about human space flight, we really don't change how we schedule. However, we will give them 3 launch attempts before they may have to go and look at their rocket, or if there's something else that's inhibiting them from launching. And then on the commercial side, we only give our commercial companies 2 launch opportunities, or a primary launch date and a backup launch date, unless there's extenuating circumstances. But once they get that launch date, we're going to not move them off. If we did try to move them off, a report or the granting of us moving them, bumping them off the schedule, as we'd call it, would have to come from the SecAF and the Secretary of Transportation.
Yeah, that's a fact that not a lot of people appreciate. Another thing, staying on the range for a minute, that I think that maybe people don't appreciate is just how critical it is to manage the commodities. These rockets, and of course our rocket in particular, but these rockets use a tremendous amount of commodities, and just managing that alone, as Colin manages all the customers on the range, making sure that we have enough commodities to launch in the time frame that we need to, is really a challenge. The range has been wonderful helping us with that. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Colin.
No, as we've gone through the wet dress rehearsals, which is fueling up the rocket, our commodities providers have really put a sharp pencil to the amount of commodities used, so that they really know. When I talked about safety earlier and being very conservative, they didn't think they would be able to support other customers as quickly as they could. But as we understand the vehicle better and the amounts of commodities used, we can really change our timelines in support of all the rest of our customers.
Great. So Mike Sarafin, we're getting close to the end of our time anyway. The airport is apparently getting quite noisy. So he wanted me to share with you all that he just got a hot update on the FTS timer from our ground ops team. We think the FTS system checks to be complete today by midnight. So we're very excited for that. That's another obvious huge milestone getting towards launch. So with that, again, if you have any extra questions, please let Jamil know, and we would be happy to answer them. This is being taped, and so let's see. Artemis 1 will. Oh, so one quick question: will Artemis 1 have a distant retrograde orbit? And will future missions use NRHO, near rectilinear halo orbit? I'll let Andy, you take that real quick, and then we'll turn it over to Jamil because Mike is in a very noisy area.
First of all, yes, for Artemis 1, we are going to a distant retrograde orbit, but that will be the final Artemis 1 mission, at least on the books, that we will be going to that orbit. For Artemis 2, that will be our first mission testing things out with crew. We'll actually not be going into a lunar orbit for that mission. We're going to be doing a free return flyby of the moon. But then it would be with Artemis 3 ongoing that we would start doing operations to the near rectilinear halo orbit, where we will be building the gateway and eventually supporting lunar surface operation missions.
Okay, thanks. And Jamil Rising, Alex, I might have misunderstood your name, Alexandra. So sorry about that. And one last super quick question, and then we will turn it over. For Lieutenant Colonel Mims, are there any long-term weather forecasts that might that we should be concerned about? P.S. It's Florida, so but we do tremendous weather forecasting. So is there anything real quick you want to add, and then we'll turn it over to Jamil?
No, and I was just beginning to type that answer up to that question in case we didn't get to it. So really, we don't really trust the accuracy of a long-term weather forecast. It's really just that it's kind of a guess. We generally begin tracking the weather at about L-3, and then even if the weather looks bad or there might be some clearing conditions, we may go into account knowing that the weather may or may not clear.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all so much. These questions were outstanding, and I cannot thank my panelists enough for taking the time. Gary Napier running the charts for us, Mike Sarafin getting ready to get on a plane, and Colin, they're ready to help make sure that we're ready to go and as safe as we should be for the public. And Andy, this is your baby, and we promise to take really good care of it. So over to Jamil. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk to everybody right before Go Day. And we're all so excited because we are going. So over to you.
Janet, just Miles Doran is asking something here. I don't know if Andy can answer just really quickly. I promise to just spend 30 seconds closing. So if it's an
I didn't scroll down. I'm going to apologize to you guys. I did not completely.
No problem, Janet. It's just let's see if we can answer
a great
that.
One too about skip reentry. Yes. Mike, can you help, or you or Andy help with skip reentry? It's like my favorite story.
Yeah. So skip entry is actually a good one because I think that is one of the unique challenges and things that we are doing different in Artemis that the Apollo era program was not able to do. Skip entry was a goal of the Apollo program because it opens up opportunities to get to where you want to recover the spacecraft easier. But at the time, there was lots of technical challenges, and they had abandoned that goal. But today, we are taking that challenge on, and it is one of the critical flight test objectives of the Artemis 1 mission, doing that skip entry. And I'll probably back up to kind of explain what that means a little bit, is that essentially for, I guess, a traditional Apollo-like capsule entry, we do a direct flight path where you come in, hit the atmosphere once, and come all the way down to splashdown. But that limits how far you can fly and where you can get to. So what we're doing is a trick that's essentially the same thing like skipping a stone across the pond. We're going to be hitting the atmosphere at just the right angle so that we can kind of bounce off of it and set ourselves up for a second entry closer to where we really want to go. And that is a complicated guidance and navigation challenge, but one that we are confident we're going to be able to accomplish. And but as you do that, it does stress the thermal protection system and make things hotter. And so it is a driver for our TPS performance. And that is why we're targeting a skip entry somewhere between 2,500 nautical miles and 4,000 nautical miles for this first mission. And that's kind of the range that allows us to learn what we need to while not being too stressing. And the whole goal is to hopefully get good, valuable data about how that system performs so that in future missions, we can potentially validate our capability to fly even further down ranges in future missions.
Okay, back over to you, Jamil. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Janet. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to the media. I know it's a super busy time for everyone, so I really, really appreciate it. We appreciate it here at the Coalition. And like Janet says, this is our last session before Artemis 1 and possibly our last session of the year. But we are totally open to feedback from you. You have my email. I've been interacting with the audience in the last 2 weeks. So please email us. Actually, this session came from a suggestion from the audience, and we are happy to take any questions and suggestions. And like Janet said in the chat, we can work together to answer more questions. I know this was a super interesting session with many questions. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a great weekend.
You did a great job, Jamil. Woo! Frank Ocean, big time. Yeah.
Janet. Bye, all.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.